So, welcome to the Everymind podcast. I'm joined today by Esther Marshall. I'm really looking forward to this episode. As always, going to dive into the personal side to mental health to show everyone how human it is, but then also really looking at what can workplaces do to improve mental health within their organization. So, Esther, really good to connect. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you? Thanks so much for having me.
No, I'm all good. I'm all good. And I think you obviously was involved in this Can Happen event, right?
Yes.
And again, amazing event. So an event that I've been involved with as well. So really looking forward to today's conversation. But as always, I think we always go straight in with a little bit about who you are. So maybe like the surface level version of Esther, and then we'll go into the personal story. But can you just let everyone listening a little bit more information about you?
Sure, of course. So hi everyone, I'm Esther. My background was working in kind of big corporates around kind of HR strategy, well-being, and ended up being kind of head of gender diversity and inclusion, looking at the overall strategy of diversity and inclusion, how we can make people feel as included and comfortable. And that included stuff like mental health, included stuff like domestic violence, family friendly, like everything like that. Outside of work, and we'll, I guess, go into the story, I have a personal attachment to why mental health is so important. And then also, and that was because of my sister, and we'll speak about that, but also from a personal point of, recently becoming a mum and, all that goes with that, and understanding, nobody tells you about these things. So I now have a 3-year-old son, and it's about balancing, your job and being a mother and trying to have it all and everything like that. So kind of, yeah, I guess there's corporate side of me, there's the mental health side of me outside work, and also being a mum kind of encapsulate kind of what I stand for.
Yeah, and I'm sure lots of people listening to this are potentially HR professionals, so I'm sure they can relate to that juggling of being a mum and your own mental health, and then obviously the work that you do as well. So I'm sure many people can relate to that story. But I want to sort of touch on a little bit about your passion for mental health, which is obviously clear to see from the work that obviously you do, and touching on potentially that personal experience. So, yeah, can you just share a little bit about your personal experience and why you're so passionate about mental health?
Of course. Yeah, so growing up, it was me and 2 other sisters. I'm the eldest, and I had a sister born 20 months after me. Super, super close, shared a room for the majority of our lives until we were about 12. And then, everything happened. We went into our own rooms, but used to always be dressed up in the same clothes. And everyone always thought actually that she was the eldest one. She was so much more confident than me. I would always stand behind her, very, very introverted. And she was very extrovert, very creative. And that kind of changed once she got into secondary school. And I kind of gained my confidence as I went to secondary school, and she kind of lost it. And that's kind of where a lot of the issues started to come out with her. I think she was an incredibly bright child and went to incredibly pushy school. And I think that pressure of you have to be perfect and you have to always perform, you can never have an off day, just started to make her kind of deteriorate. And less and less she was going out with friends, less and less she was doing, she was always the one that was out, and now less and less that was the case. She did unbelievably in all of her exams, went to medical school, and that's where we started to see a kind of spiral out of control. I think it was too much, especially as we've all heard in the news with junior doctors and how much pressure is on them. There was already a kind of anxiety and depression that had been diagnosed, but we didn't have anything further than that. But doing an A&E rotation and constantly having people die on your watch and not being basically being like a year qualified and having to, look after all of these people in such kind of dire kind of conditions with lack of sleep, which we know also affects mental health. And she started having psychotic episodes. I didn't know at first what they were, but then was with her in A&E, and then we had the whole issue with the kind of NHS services within mental health provision, which again is a conversation for another time, but how the system is broken and how we managed to eventually get her into a hospital, but it took us ages in order to do so. And basically from then, every year it was, we'd think we'd have it okay. We think we'd got a diagnosis. We'd get her on the right medication. She'd come out of hospital. She'd kind of just about get back into the real world. And then we'd have another relapse and she'd go back in. which was horrible to watch, especially during the psychosis, and especially watching the kind of the manic phases and then also the depressive phases. There were a few times where there weren't enough beds in hospital, so she stayed with me, and I had to go and get the medication for her and then administer the medication. So it was a real kind of step up in, understanding around mental health, around mental illness, the dosages, how a tiny increase or decrease affects so much, and how, if you have cancer treatment, it's very much you will have this amount of chemotherapy, whereas in mental illness, we don't know how you're going to react to this medicine, so things can take a lot longer and there can be huge side effects. And in fact, my sister actually came off the antipsychotics at one point because she said she'd prefer, one of the side effects was she carried on eating, so she put on weight, and she had a bit of a control around eating. It was never diagnosed as an eating disorder, but it was the one thing she could control. So she said to me one day, and I remember it clearly, I'd prefer to be psychotic than overweight. And so we had a big spiral at that point. And over the years, she was in mental health wards, NHS mental health wards, for 4 or 5 months at a time, visiting her most days and understanding how the NHS works, how the medication system works. They are harrowing places to go and visit and be there. And, you could be there for half an hour, and then depending on what state she was in, she would then say, please leave, or you could be there for 5 hours. You just don't know. And the amount of stuff that goes on while you're there with other patients as well. It's just a really harrowing place to be, which always seemed to me so strange when someone's trying to get better, how they can be in such a harrowing place. For her, luckily, for some of it, she didn't remember, when you're in the psychotic episode. But for me, every time I just come out and sit in the car and just cry before I went anywhere. And I was there most days. And ultimately, it took us 6 years to get, I've missed out loads, but just as a summary, but it took us 6 years to get the proper diagnosis that she had bipolar. And there was one amazing consultant that said to us, look, I think they put you on antidepressants because you're treating the depression, but I think that's hiding the mania. So let's take you off all of your medication, see what happens on no medication in a controlled environment, and then work it out. And that was really harrowing, because watching the psychosis with no medication and watching the mania with no medication and depression with no medication was just the scariest, most horrible thing you could watch someone that you love go through. And then ultimately, this consultant was amazing and got her on the right medication and got her better. And she was really just about starting life again. And the more and more consultants and psychologists and psychiatrists I've spoken to have now said that actually, ironically, once they're a little bit better, they can start to think straighter about what they want to do. So although she spoke about suicide while she was going through the psychosis, the consultant said, we don't think she'll go through with it because she can't right now. And so 27th of January, 2 years ago, my mum came home to a note. And then we had the police knock on the door to say that they'd found my sister's body. And life just changed in an instant. I still can't sit on that specific sofa in my parents' house when the police came. I still have flashbacks. I couldn't sleep for weeks. Then you go through the whole thing of, could I have done anything better? I was there every day, but maybe I could have done this, maybe I could have done that. And that whole thing of, well, I helped her get better. And ultimately, is that the reason why we then lost her? So it's been a long journey. It was then, 27th of January, we then in March went into lockdown. So I had an 18-month-old whilst doing a full-time role at Unilever whilst trying to grieve. And it was a real wake-up sign to me of, although I've been looking after my sister and prioritizing her mental health, now is the time for me to prioritize my own mental health. And while I went on maternity leave, my sister said to me, I was getting very angry around the fact that all the books that I was reading to my son didn't have any empowering messages or important messages that they need, especially as I was doing diversity inclusion for my job. It was like my bread and butter. There was no representation. So how can we expect kids to really achieve their potential if they aren't seeing themselves? And one of the things Rebecca loved to do with her mental health was draw. And she was a phenomenal artist. And she said to me, look, I'm kind of off work at the moment because I'm recovering. Why don't you write the book that you want to read to your son? And I'll do the illustrations for it. And I thought, oh, what a lovely project that we can do together. She then went back into hospital and she said to me, look, I just don't think I have the strength to do the illustrations, but please find someone else to do it and come and show me. So I would go to the hospital and show her the book as it was kind of happening and the whole process. So she really fed into it. That one was Sophie Says, I Can, I Will, all about what she was saying about young girls really understanding what they can do in life and not having all of the media and everything that kind of puts them down, like where they can go if they really believe in themselves. And poignantly, she read that book to my son. I didn't know at the time that everything was going to happen. And the 2 nights after she passed away, I wrote the second one, Sophie Says It's Okay Not to Be Okay, in her memory. And the more and more I was working on the books, the more I felt connected to her. And I kind of, throughout lockdown, working at Unilever, trying to do that, trying to look after my son, trying to grieve, which is virtually impossible when you can't see anyone, especially with Rebecca, because she was very much I want to see you when I speak to you, because the anxiety would be too much on the phone. She didn't know if you were lying. So I just thought, okay, well, once lockdown's over, I'll open the door and she'll be there again. So I couldn't grieve properly. And so I eventually sat down with my bosses at Unilever and said, look, I have to give this a try. This is where I feel connected to my sister. This is making so much of a difference. Over lockdown, so many parents are saying this is helping me talk to my child about their feelings. I was like, if I can give my sister this legacy, then that's, the least I can do for her in her memory. And so about 5 months ago now, I left my kind of corporate role. And I've been working on kind of providing mental health resources for teachers and parents and children through these books and other education hubs that we're doing, in the hope that I can, keep her legacy alive. Yeah.
It's amazing. Such an amazing story. And me nodding through some of it because I can just relate to a lot of it. And I think, what you're doing now, trying to turn that story into a positive so soon after, I believe as well, your sister, I think is inspiring and amazing. Like, I do the same with obviously my dad and losing my dad to suicide, but, trust me, took me like 4 years to talk to one person about it because I know how difficult those first 2 years are. And equally, if I had to be in lockdown during those first 2 years, I don't know how I would have dealt with it. So massively inspiring, and hats off to you for the amazing work that you're doing. And there's so much that I want to ask you. I think the first question that I want to ask you is because, the marathons I've just run are about the school system and about young people, and we do a lot of work in the corporate space and we do a lot of preventative work. But, your story, how different do you think it would have been if you would have been educated on it? Because you spoke about the mental health unit, you spoke about not really understanding mental illness, and almost, I guess, trying to support your sister. It was very much like reactive, like, I don't really know what I'm doing, I'm just trying my best. How different do you think it would have been for your sister and for you if there was more education earlier on?
Yeah, I speak to my grief counselor about this a lot. She's told me that I can't keep going over it in my head because we'll never have an answer, but it comes up a lot of, I genuinely think the outcome would have been different. I genuinely believe that. And especially now watching my 3-year-old, we don't give kids enough credit of how much they understand, how much they get, how resilient they can be if they're taught the right things, how much they really need parents and teachers to be able to talk them through their feelings, because they need to be directed, but actually they're also directing us. So although I think a lot of people think it's parents and teachers need to teach children, it's vice versa. My son is teaching me so much. And I think the education system needs to change completely, in that it's more of a mutualistic kind of learning rather than teachers and parents just telling kids what to do. And I think it's that connection that's missing, which is why I know the work we do with Beyond, and I'm also working with them in Happy Space, some of the amazing things that are done for kind of older kids. But for me, watching my son and also seeing Rebecca in the kind of early years, it's like there is nothing really out there for kind of age 2 to 7, because people think they can't handle this, but they really can. My son already, like, we sit and we talk about feelings. He says, "Mummy, I'm sad." And then we talk about, are you sad, or are you angry, or are you scared? And the fact that he can at 3 years old decipher those 3 different things, I couldn't do. Even in my grief counseling, I was like, I can't tell whether I'm in pain. I can't tell whether I'm numb. I can't, if our kids learn it at this age, as I've kind of put into kind of branding, like Sophie says, making life's most important lessons fun to learn. That's what we want to do, really, is take this angst out of everything that we're doing and everything. It needs to be so hard and so dark. It doesn't need to be dark if we're being proactive about it rather than reactive about it. Yes, in Rebecca's case, in your dad's case, and many other cases, it's a really dark system to be part of. But if we can do it at the beginning of their lives, we can make it a really happy place and make it okay if it's not happy, and that's really what I'm championing. But yes, would I love to kind of change policy, change education the way it is? I mean, I'm literally looking at the moment of applying to schools for my son, and the system is broken. And yeah, am I there, the first person kind of flying the flag to change the education system? Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's just funny. Like, I think about my youngest is 5, and I did a talk on vulnerability the other day. So, like, talking about vulnerability in the workplace, and I was thinking about how I've got 2 boys, 2 sons. I encourage emotion from my 2 boys. Like, I want them to talk openly about it. I want them to know that it's okay to talk about their mental health. But even as a dad myself, I found myself saying to my 5-year-old, when he was 4 or 5 or whatever, come on, stop crying. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Like, stop crying. It's going to be fine. Now, I was questioning when I was putting this talk together of why. Like, why did I say that? Because I know that it's okay for him to cry, and I want him to show emotion and everything else. And I was thinking to myself, the reason why I say that is because I'm not ready to feel that. Like, I'm not ready to feel and see the pain of my son crying, because I was brought up to believe that crying's bad, right? And being sad is bad. But actually, a 5-year-old being sad is okay. And me saying, come on, stop crying, wipe your eyes, is just because I'm not like ready to hear him cry and deal with my own emotion around that. Yeah. And it's then funny how, when you look at vulnerability, my dad was a very compassionate guy and, very sensitive guy and a good dad. But we had those moments as well, like, come on, stop crying, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. So, like, as I grow up, I then start to think, I don't want to cry, I can't cry, it's not good. And that emotion, as I always say, specifically with men and young boys, that emotion doesn't go away. It just turns into anger, turns into other things. So I think it's so important what you're doing. And I'm sure, again, probably going back to the HR point of it as well, the work that you was doing at Unilever and in the workplace, I'm sure, again, you could probably see how if we change the education system, that would be a lot easier for you guys as well.
Yeah, everything we were doing at Unilever was preventative.
Yeah.
Was reactive, because of stuff that could have been prevented through education systems, without a doubt. It's ingrained in society, and especially because it's a global company, ingrained in other societies, even more so than the UK, that just bring up this kind of, this is how you should be, this is how, the amount of burnout that we had, because people didn't know when to say, I'm feeling like I might burn out, because people thought that was weak. It's about changing that narrative of, actually, it's so strong for someone to come forward and be like, this is a lot. And I didn't, until it got too much of like, no, Esther, you should be able to work full time with an 18-month-old in lockdown, after you've just received the news that your sister's body's been found, and you've got the police report, and you've got the hearing, and you've been trying for the past 6 years to maintain your career whilst in and out of mental health wards. I still thought I was weak for saying, like, maybe I want to leave my career. It was a real point of a crossroads of like, I have to do this. And it was because of my son that I did, because I was like, otherwise I'm not going to be able to, be the mum that I want to be for him. I need to take some time for myself and kind of be with Rebecca and feel that, because if I'm not going to feel it, it's going to come out in another way. And we did that research over lockdown. I was really intrigued to see, and we commissioned some external research, and over 80% of parents were worried about their child's mental health, but only a third of them had anything in the house that would talk about it or deal with it, because parents were so scared of what to say. They were like, I don't want to make it worse, which is why I basically, did the books. And then also we did an activity book that went with the books, which basically had pointers at the bottom of each page of like, parents, if you're worried, don't say anything other than what's on the pages. And we had so many messages from parents be like, my son said this, or my daughter said this, or actually I've just lost my father to COVID and we had the funeral and your books arrived, and now actually my daughter was telling me about how she felt, and we could talk about it. And it's done through fun ways. I've put like a bunny in there, so Bunny's hiding on every single page, so a lot of young kids are like, we want to read the Bunny book. I'm like, that's absolutely fine. I'd love them to find Bunny on every page, whilst parents are reading these messages. It's okay not to be okay. It's okay to cry, because they'll go in subliminally. And it's about making it fun rather than dark.
Yeah, so important. And like you say, education is so important, because even a lot of the work that we do in the workplace, so Everymind at work, what we focus on as the biggest challenge is stigma, right? So that stigma in the workplace. And people question awareness still in 2021, but we're still so far behind, because as you've said, it's like we're not educated on that. And I'm sure even like those activities that we should be doing with our kids, if we did them with leaders and stuff, they probably would benefit from it as well, because
without doubt,
we've never had that education around it. And I think it's no matter the initiative that you launch in a business, no matter what you try and do, if stigma and shame still exists, then you're not going to be able to reach those people. Because as you've said, that shame that your sister probably carried, the shame that you carried, the shame that I carried, the shame that my dad carried, the shame that everyone carries, is because of poor education and stigma. And a new initiative launched in the workplace doesn't change that. Like, you have to start with education, awareness, and tackling that stigma first, because as you said, it's so important. And you touched on your sister's journey as well, which I just want to briefly touch on as well, about how there was pressure at school and to be perfect and all of that. And how much of an impact do you think that has on everyone in general as well, that pressure to be perfect?
Yeah, I mean, so much so that her school asked me to come and read the books, and I just said it's a step too far. I just can't walk into that institution, because I know the pressure that they put on her. And it was always, you have to achieve, you have to go to Oxbridge, you have to get full marks. I mean, there was no let up whatsoever. I remember watching her, because I didn't go to a school that was like that. And I just remember seeing the difference in her, and how schools get away with that now, I just don't know. There's still many of them out there, and some children thrive on being told that they need to do better, but there's a way that you can do it without this idea of perfectionism, that it's never going to happen. And then you instill in these children an unrealistic expectation from day one. So what do you expect? And I just can't get my head around that. And now for choosing schools with my son, I am looking at that. I'm asking questions which I wouldn't have done a few years ago, of what's the pastoral care like? What art do you have? A mental well-being room? Do you have a music space? How much do you focus on art? Things where they can be creative rather than they have to do well in maths and English. Those things can be taught, but like, are we bringing up our children to be resilient beings? Myself and Rebecca grew up in a world where there was no social media, and we got to this place. What are we going to do with our children that have then social media as well? It just needs to be a vital part of education right now, which, I've seen some schools are doing it, but it's off their own backs, because their teachers or their staff or their well-being leads actually care about that, rather than this is baseline curriculum of what it needs to be.
Yeah, and that social media point's really interesting, because there was an interesting study that showed that individuals that feel fulfilled, that have purpose, that have high levels of self-esteem, social media doesn't impact them. But those that don't, those who have low self-esteem, aren't fulfilled, feel lonely, social media has a massive impact on them. And I'm my eldest, I see a lot of the school talking about social media and the impacts of social media, but the gap is they're not teaching kids to have high self-esteem and resilience and everything else. So it's fine taking away social media, warning people of the dangers, but actually, why don't we, as you say, from a very young age, talk about resilience and self-esteem and everything else? Because then, of course, social media is still going to be hard for people, but like we say, if that study is true and you feel good within yourself, social media doesn't have a massive impact on you.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's, and I think again that carries through to the workplace, and I want to touch on personal experience, because obviously you've been open today, and again, hats off to you for being so open in such a short space of time after your sister. But I know you've obviously done talks in organizations and things like that. How much importance do you put on personal experience in the workplace in someone like you, sharing your story to individuals?
I think it does help. Anytime I do a talk, I have so many people that come up to me after and say, oh, I think I'm struggling, but I didn't necessarily know, like maybe I'll go and speak to my line manager about it. Or, oh, I am actually a line manager and I've seen some of these signs in some of my people, but I hadn't really thought about it. Maybe I should think about it. And I think that personal experience, it's just human heart, isn't it? And I think a lot of business has kind of forgotten that, especially because of COVID. Like in parts it has, I feel like business leaders become more personal. You saw them at home, they might have their families, whereas you only ever saw them in a corporate space, so that has helped. But it's also made everybody so much more distant, because when there's a screen in front of you, you don't have to be as open. So I think there's a massive advantage in a way to saying, and although it does still hurt, and I have coping mechanisms after each talk I do of like how to then go home, sit and deal with it, so that I actually know what I've done that day rather than just going straight into the next thing. It's helping other people because they're hearing personal stories. It's making it human. And that for me is then creating a culture, because you can have great ideas, but it's once the education and the culture is embedded that things start to take off. If you don't have that, it's not going to happen.
100%. Yeah, it's like you say, it's making it human. It's understanding that every time I do a talk, it's understanding. It took me a long time to get here, but everyone listening to this is a human being. Like, people are going to react to it very differently. Some people might have the same experience as me, some people might not, but it's, can I make people in this next hour reconnect with them being a human being, them having mental health, and potentially approaching it in a different way? And I think, as you've said, that is needed so much in the workplace. Like we do lots of polls on our sessions, and I think we've polled over 10,000 people in the last year, and there's a question that we ask people of like, who would you speak to about your mental health at work? And we have like HR, mental health first aiders, EAP, everything. And then we have no one at work. And like, you probably don't need me to tell you this, it's like basically nearly 50% of people that we ask that question to say no one at work. And that organization has a huge amount of resources, do a lot for mental health, but still there is something ingrained in these individuals that they don't feel like they can talk to anyone at work. And as when you look at it, you spend a third of your life at work. That's a very lonely place to be if you can't speak to anyone about it. And I think, as you said, personal experience, whether it's you, whether it's someone else, that makes people remember that they're human. It's okay to talk about it, and then they might feel more comfortable to share to a colleague. So I think, again, personal experience plays a massive part. And then also just, with Unilever and the work that you've done, is there anything else that you've seen businesses do that's had a big impact when it comes to mental health in general?
Yeah, I do think that mental health first aiders help, but I think it's only a first stage. It needs to come not only from the kind of well-being leads. The next stage for me was then leadership, which we were very lucky at Unilever to have great leadership that always kind of spoke openly about, I'm struggling, I need a day, I need this or whatever. Then the thing for me was always, okay, middle management, right? That have grown up in the very hard kind of stages of life of a bit like, you were saying about your dad, it was, you will succeed, you will do this. You can't not be okay. Just keep going, keep going, keep going. And until that part of the workforce understand that it's okay not to be okay, I don't think we're going to get through. That for me was the biggest wall. And I know at a lot of companies still the leadership aren't there. I was very lucky at Unilever that they were, but I always found that middle management was the biggest kind of breaking point for me of like, we're moving, we're chugging along very slowly, but we're getting there. And then you hit this wall because they just can't understand it. Like, you're at work, you're getting paid. Like, why would you not carry on? I don't have time to go and talk to all my people and see how they're doing. They should just be getting on. That's what HR is for, or that's what this is for. It's like, well, then you're not embedding a culture of safety within your team. And when they used to come to me and be like, oh, another person's resigned, I used to be like, well, yeah, I'm not surprised, you know, with the kind of culture that's in that team. And it's never everywhere, but we talk about culture. Yes, there's a culture at company level, but I think line managers have so much importance here that there's a culture within teams. Even on the floor that I sat in, there were like 30 different teams. That's 30 different cultures that someone's creating. So as a team lead or a line manager, there's so much importance. And I used to find when I was working at Unilever and with other companies that we then used to work with, one of the biggest things is that people get promoted on their knowledge of a subject rather than on how they can deal with people. So I used to business partners, senior leaders who were like, I don't want to have a horrible conversation with someone. I can't tell them they're not doing their job. Can you do that? That's what HR is for. And it's like, how are you so senior, yet you can't do that? So no wonder you're not embedding a culture, because yes, you have a phenomenal expertise of X subject, but you've been at a company for 15 years and you've never managed somebody. You know, and that's the same kind of thing I see as what we were talking about before with like the 3-year-olds and getting it right at the beginning of why is there not more training when people enter the workforce into how to have a difficult conversation with someone, how to do that. Now, as an HR professional, I feel absolutely fine to do all of those, but it's only HR that gets that training at the beginning rather than anybody else. And that again is the kind of missing link.
Yeah, so important. And again, it's like the way that I kind of look at that is, as you say, you've got your whole company, and at the top, you've got fresh flowing water coming through, and then you've kind of got, toxic being put in place. And by the time it gets to the bottom, it's completely toxic. And it's about, as you say, trying to look at the important role that a line manager plays, but just, as you say, some simple education. And I think it comes back to that personal experience, making them realize it's human again. Like, I've done loads of talks to people that just don't get it, construction workers, whatever, but equally they walk out of that talk feeling human again and can potentially see it in a way because maybe they're a parent, maybe they understand it because their children are going through it, or, and it's about making sure that they are educated, as you've said, because, a good manager isn't someone that's been at the business for a long time or is good at their job. It's someone who's good with people, and that's so important. So I think that's a really, really important piece of advice for people to take away as well.
I think it brings it closer to home as well, right? It's like, oh, that's always somebody else's problem. And then suddenly you have one of these talks and you're like, oh, that really could be me. Like mental health does not discriminate, it doesn't matter who you are, where you've grown up, like it's the same as physical health. You could, one day be diagnosed with X, Y, and Z, same with mental health, mental illness. And I think that human side then lends it to, oh, wow, this is closer to home than I thought it was.
And on that question, did you ever feel like you would be impacted by this?
Be impacted by, sorry?
Mental illness, like yourself. Did you ever feel like you would have to go through what you've been through growing up?
No, I think I didn't see any of it coming, really. I started to see with Rebecca things changing, but it, in a way, sadly, she kind of educated on me. So like when I then had my son and there was no sleep, no anything, we were still dealing with Rebecca in and out of hospital. There was a lot going on. It was, how can I put stuff in place to protect my mental health, rather than thinking I have to be the superwoman mom that can do that, can do this, can do that. And it was like, it was okay for me to say, sorry guys, I just need a day, or can someone come over and just take the baby for 2 hours while I go back to sleep because I've been up with him for 7 hours, rather than pushing through and feeling like you had to be this kind of superhero because you're never allowed to have that. Does it run in the family? I don't know. It never had done before. have I got a heightened awareness of it to double check? Yes. With everything that I've been through in the past 2 years as well, regardless of whether it's in the family or genetic, like it was a lot. For me personally, I found the police report just the worst, but talking about it for me has helped. I'm putting things in place with my grief counselor to work out on how I can do it. But I think if I didn't have those things in place, I'd be in a very, very different place.
Yeah. No, I asked because I always start my talk by saying I didn't believe mental illness would impact me until the day that it did, because I did not expect my dad to ever struggle, my dad to take his own life, any of that, because my education of mental illness growing up was very, black and white, and however brutal this sounds, straitjackets, padded cells, and personalities that didn't look like us. So that was what I was taught to believe. So if you would have told me at 16, 17 years old, your dad's about to take his own life, I would laugh. Like, that is never happening to us. So I think it's, going back to that line manager education and talks in the workplace, it's getting people to actually sit back and realize this impacts so many more people than you believe. You are human, you have mental health. It can impact you the same way as you say physical illness can impact anyone. And just getting them to understand it slightly differently can then maybe get them to approach it differently with their team and everything else. But yeah, I'm glad, like you say, you found those tools for your own self as well. Just touching on those tools, what do you do for your own mental health in particular?
Yeah, I've started to go swimming. I was doing running. Rebecca used to love running, so I always felt like when I was running, I was with her.
Darn, that's so similar. So similar. Like, it's same with my dad. Like, me and my dad used to run together.
Right.
Going for a run is me and my dad having a conversation. Like, it's so strange, isn't it? Like you say.
Yeah, and I think because she used to have to walk at least like 5 or 6 miles a day. Like, she would walk to the hospital she was working at or whatever, and walk back in order to kind of keep her mental health as okay as it could be. But I just always felt like running kept me with her. But then I also felt that I was never actually switching off, because I was either listening to a podcast or I was, I was like, oh, my phone's on me, I'll just check if I'm, on my like warm down or whatever. And Rebecca also loves swimming. So I've started doing that because I can't have my phone on me. I literally, and it's really good, it helps me think creatively, because there is nothing I can do other than swim. And that for me has just been fantastic. And it makes me take a bit more of my day, because I have to get there. Whereas with a run, I literally could just go straight. I have to get there, I have to swim, shower, like all of those things. And it gives me a good kind of hour that I wouldn't have ever given myself in a day. And that for me has just been fantastic. The other thing as well, it's all to do with Rebecca. She absolutely loved baking and cooking. I mean, absolutely loved it. So I love kind of finding some of her favorite recipes and doing those. And she always loved really intricate recipes. So it's not like I can have TV on in the background or look at my phone or anything. Like, I really need to concentrate. And all of these things help me switch off and either be with her or just be in my own presence, rather than the crazy amount of, things that are going on in everyone's life. So those two things for me, I try and kind of build into every week.
Nice. It's really cool. I like swimming, actually. The way you've said that is, it's like, I was just thinking aloud, because I say running is like mindfulness to me, but equally there's those distractions of, oh, I'm just going to check my phone, or I'm going to do this. Whereas swimming seems to be like forced mindfulness. Like, you can't do anything else but be mindful in the water.
Yeah, like my phone is locked away, and if I don't swim, like, it's not going to happen. So I've been doing that for a few months now, and it's been really quite game changing.
Yeah, and even like you say, the getting ready, like the shower afterwards, like all of that kind of stuff, it's that routine as well that helps you take that hour out of your day, or whatever it is, 90 minutes out of your day for that. It's really, really cool. Thanks for sharing. And then last question. So this is a little bit of a different question. It's like a one thing that we always ask some of our guests. Can you share one piece of advice that you were given that's resonated the most with you?
Yeah, probably doesn't work with podcasts, but there was a mental health nurse that was on the ward with Rebecca who once said to me, listen more than you speak. And it just like changed everything in my life, because especially while Rebecca was going through psychosis, she'd bring up all this stuff And I'd feel like I needed to tell her, like, it's not that, it's this or whatever. And ultimately she just wanted me to listen. And I found that also in my professional life, like, people trust you more when you listen, because it's not about you, it's about them. So I know with the podcast you're asking about my story and I'm speaking, but I really try and instill that in the majority of like the work that I do now. It's about listening to the other person and hearing about them and their story or what they want. And that, for me, I try and put that into my everyday life.
Yeah, I love that. Again, it's funny, like when I do my talk, I talk about ask, listen, signpost. And I tell them the importance of listening after I've just spoken for an hour. So you always feel a bit awkward for suggesting that. But like, I honestly, I think that's so important. I always love the quote, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason.
Yeah.
But also like the listening piece when it comes to mental health. I remember with my dad, like similar to what you just shared with Rebecca there, you know, when my dad started to open up to me, I would stop, like, Dad, stop. You know, you've got nothing to be worried about. Like, we love you, you know, why don't we go for a walk? We'll come back, we'll watch the football, you know. And I would go into this like solution mindset. And I never understood why. But when I look back, I'm like, I wanted to solve it because I wasn't ready to hear what he was about to tell me. Like, I'm not, you know, my dad's about to tell me that he's really struggling, you know, potentially that he's feeling suicidal. I don't want to hear that. I'm not ready to hear that. So I naturally jump in with like this solution and feel like that's the best way. And then when I struggled, you know, myself, I remember thinking to myself, I don't want your solution. I just want your ears. Like, that's all I want. I don't want you to solve it for me. If I feel comfortable to talk to you, Esther, like I'm sharing, just listen, like just give me your ears. That's it. And people really struggle with that because, as you said, you know, when someone's telling you their true feelings, it's hard to hear, isn't it? It's very difficult to hear. So is that something that you still find difficult now, or are you better at it, the listening part?
I'm getting better. I think, especially my grief counselor now, she said to me, you wanted to fix her. I was like, yeah, I wanted to fix her. And I failed in that. So now can I find other people to fix? You know, that's where I went straight away. And my grief counselor has been helping me in that. You don't need to fix anyone. That's not what you're here to do. You know, you're already out of your depth trying to fix Rebecca. Even like, you know, big consultants who've been doing this for years couldn't do that. Like, I was so out of my depth. It's not about fixing. It's about humanizing, as we've been talking about, and it's about finding a path and giving other people tools. It's not fixing, and not being able to fix is also not your fault. That's one thing I've been working on a lot.
Amazing. Honestly, I think suicide grief is a very, very individual grief. And when you speak to someone who's been through it, like, yeah, there's been so much that you said that's resonated with me. And I'm sure anyone who's listening to this that might have had a similar experience have potentially resonated as well. So I really want to sort of thank you for that. Just to finish up, where can people connect with you? How can they find out about the books?
Yeah, sure. So we're at Sophie Says Official on Instagram, sophiesaysofficial.com online. There's tons of lesson plans for parents, teachers on there, free to download. They've all been designed by educational psychologists with us and been, you know, put together and designed with the Sophie Says character. So yeah, I'd love for as many people to have it as possible. You know, all completely free. The books obviously you pay for, but yeah, we just want as many children to feel as comfortable as possible and kind of grow up in a world where they start to feel a bit more resilient and can achieve their full potential because of that.
Amazing. And do you do still talks in organizations as well?
Yeah. So I definitely do. I'm in and out of organizations all the time. I do a lot of consultancy with organizations around diversity, inclusion, mental health, all of that kind of stuff as well. I just think it's so important.
Amazing. And what we'll do is we'll connect in the show notes to this. We'll put your LinkedIn, your email address and things like that as well if people want to reach out to you. But Esther, thank you so much for being so honest today and sharing. I've really appreciated you coming on. It's been really good to connect as well.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.